The Road to Autonomy is presented by the Road to Autonomy Index. The Road to Autonomy Index is a rules-based equity benchmark index that measures the performance of a basket of global companies that are involved in the development and commercialization of autonomy. Institutional investors and fund managers are watching megatrends that are shaping investment opportunities today. These megatrends are creating thematic investment ideas and opportunities for forward-thinking investors. We believe that one of the biggest megatrends today is autonomy. That's why we created the Road to Autonomy Index, the world's first and only pure-play index to track the thematic investment opportunity in autonomy. Follow the Road to Autonomy Index on your favorite finance app by simply typing in the ticker Autonomy. To learn more about the Road to Autonomy Index, visit roadtoautonomy.com/index. Hello and welcome to the Road to Autonomy. I'm your host, Grayson Brulte. On today's episode, we're absolutely honored to welcome back David Welch, Detroit Bureau Chief Bloomberg. David, welcome back.
Great to be here as always. Always fun. Great way to end the year.
It is a great way to end the year because there's a lot of stuff to talk about. There's big change coming at GM. There's big change coming in the autonomy market. And David, to kick things off, where does GM go with Cruise now they laid off 24% of the workforce, including 9 key senior executives?
Yeah, well, the 9 key senior executives were all the people in government affairs, legal, and operations, namely the COO, whose hands were on how they handled the fallout from that accident where the woman was dragged. So I think that's all directly related to that. CEO was already out. So, that's partly cleaning up the mess of their government affairs, how they handle their public image and being a member of the community. And, they'll be bringing in new people for that. So that's one bit of the next. Look, they're going to start off in one city. So they're sort of stepping back 18 months. In terms of their rollout, it does raise a big question if they even really push robo-taxi. Or does this at some point become part of General Motors developing self-driving, personally owned autonomous vehicles? They've got this new guy from Apple, Mike Abbott, runs a software group for infotainment and, the whole GM replacement for CarPlay. He's got that group out in San Francisco. Do they just pull this in? They could. They might have a tough time retaining talent if they do that. But there are some very open questions as to whether or not they're going to stick with robotaxi. They say they are, but things change, especially when the company's in the condition it's in.
I don't see GM having the wherewithal to continue with robotaxis. When the news of the layoffs, the GM stock rallied 6.65% to close at 36.08. So investors clearly like the news there. And then we had the news last week where GM absorbed BrightDrop. Travis Katz is out, and they absorbed BrightDrop. So there is a precedent for moves that GM's making. And Mary Barr has made public statements over the years about the opportunity on personally owned autonomous vehicles. Paul Jacobson, their CFO, has made public statements as well. If it does come in-house, does it become part of the Super Cruise division? Or where inside of GM will it live if it does indeed come in-house?
I think it would report to Mike Abbott. He's the software guru that they have who's, running all of their, new technology stuff. He was an engineer. What was he? Was he head of engineering at Apple? His title at GM is Executive Vice President for Software. And let's see, at Apple, he was... I'm pulling it up here while we're talking.
He was on Project Titan.
He was. Weird. His LinkedIn page doesn't have anything on it, but I thought that's where he came from. But look, he's a Silicon Valley guy, and he's overseeing all the hiring of software engineers, all the development of software. And I think, you could see Cruise getting pulled. Yes, he was vice president of engineering for 5 years at Apple. So that's a big job. He was at Neuro before that. So this is a Valley guy. He was at a company acquired by Cisco. He's got a long history in software development. This was a big hire for GM. So he could sort of subsume it into his organization. That does bring up a big problem. A lot of these software engineers, AI people, they went to work for Cruise because, that they'd get an ownership piece that eventually would be monetized. And they'd be changing the world with robotaxis. They can still change the world with self-driving technology, but geez, it looks like a longer road. Morale can't be great there. And I think it's going to be tough for them to attract and retain talent just as General Motors.
I agree with all that. I'm going to give you a crazy statement. I've been thinking a lot about the odds of GM doing it are probably less than 0.1% chance, but I start thinking about this from a capital investment standpoint, all the billions of dollars that GM has put into Cruise, the billions at Microsoft. You want to talk about good timing. SoftBank looks really good now for getting out when they did and not going down with the ship the same way they went down with WeWork. Looking at the media business, Rich Greenfield, the media analyst, has this saying it's an arms dealer, where Paramount should become an arms dealer and license all of their content to Netflix, Disney+, Hulu, all the platforms out there. And so I started thinking about this. In a hypothetical world, GM has the resources, both from a financial standpoint and an engineering standpoint. Do they restructure Cruise as an independent entity, full control of GM, and then make it an arms dealer and start licensing the self-driving tech to try and monetize it? Because there's a clear case that can be made to Wall Street. We're not going to run a robo-taxi business. We're going to become an arms dealer, and we're going to license this to anybody that wants to buy it. And there's precedent in the market. This is where Pony AI is going in America now. They're looking at becoming an arms dealer and licensing their self-driving there, and apparently it's in the new Lucid vehicles. Could GM do something similar?
I think that could eventually be the real race or battle between Cruise and Waymo, is licensing this technology to the car companies. You and I have talked about robo-taxi in the past. There's a business there, but it's really not clear what it is. I don't think Uber and Lyft customers, or for that matter, yellow cab customers, I don't think they care who's driving, whether it's a human or a robot. As long as the vehicle's there on time, the experience is pretty good, and they get where they need to go. Now, GM's case is that with some of the variance in quality of driver, let's say, they can guarantee a better experience with their vehicles. But that means you got to find a way to clean it and all of that. I've always wondered about the robo-taxi business in the sense that you're not paying for the driver, but that driver paid for a lot of costs that Uber and Lyft don't have to cover. Depreciation and amortization of very expensive high-tech cars being one of them. That's one of the things that Cruise, Waymo, whoever owns a robo-taxi fleet is going to have to pay for or take it out of their income statement anyways. Then there are cash costs. There's insuring the vehicles, charging, parking when they're not running, maintenance, all of that stuff. And, fleet management's tough. So, these are costs to that business that make it, less the gold mine we thought 5 years ago. Remember, 5 years ago, we had McKinsey and others predicting a $3-4 trillion total addressable market. And I remember talking to Uber and Lyft about self-driving vehicles, and they're like, yeah, we want the asset light model. We're just the guys with the app, and we'll have this software-driven vehicle, and then we rake it in. And they wanted to pay someone else to manage the fleet. But someone still has to do it. It still costs money. And I'm just not sure how profitable this business is. If your whole business model is undercutting Uber and Lyft, but being a bit better than public transit, there's a business there. It's very difficult to see how profitable it is. So that's the backdrop here. And then if that's the case, what we do know is that customers like and pay a lot of money for GM Super Cruise, Ford Blue Cruise, Tesla Autopilot. It's monetized right now. So if Waymo and Cruise are developing the super advanced version of that, truly autonomous version of that, and I think luxury buyers would pay a lot of money for that. That's something you can monetize quickly. Technology has to work right, but it has to be monetized quickly. And that's where it gets a little trickier because we don't see Cruise and Waymo vehicles driving everywhere in big numbers right now. Cruise doesn't do anything on the highway. I think Waymo does, but their fleet's pretty small out there. They're not driving in huge numbers. So I think that could be eventually the race, but even that's quite a ways away. I think this will test both companies' will to keep paying for development of this.
Hit the nail on the head. Autonomy is a luxury product. It's not a mass market product. It is not a public transportation market. It's not a subsidy. It's a luxury product. The opportunity where I see with the money is the experience layer. I was in the Waymo vehicle in San Francisco a few weeks ago, and I'm driving around San Francisco, riding around San Francisco in the Waymo car, in the rain, listening to Kinda Blue by Miles and this great sound system. That was fantastic. Now, if you put a commerce layer on top of that, or I could buy an exclusive track for Miles Davis Estate or something, okay, now you got a commerce play there. Then you start factoring in, perhaps there's a piece of memorabilia I could buy, or if you're shopping, you can buy something. That's where this really comes into. If you have a consistent experience for the passenger within a shopping experience, that's where the money comes in. Mercedes is starting to look in this with their Mercedes Pay they're building in the e-commerce platform. Does Alphabet looked to put Google in the car somehow, monetize it perhaps. I'll give you an example. There's a YouTube car where there's certain types of exclusive content available and start to really monetize all those assets where it works together. If you're in the car 35, 40 minutes, you can watch a YouTube show or you can engage in some sort of content that's monetizable.
Yeah, look, I've talked about this for years too. That is where this should be to start. I mean, you have a super expensive technology that's difficult to develop, and everybody kind of went the reverse of where technology usually starts. They tried to go to the mass market in the most difficult cities to drive. I kind of always thought that Voyage, which was just absorbed by Cruise a few years ago, had the right idea. They were developing these for very specific cases, retirement communities. I thought stuff like Disney or the Bourbon Trail, stuff like that with fixed routes and an absolute need. Elderly people maybe can't drive or maybe shouldn't be driving, so it's great to have a service for them like that. People on the Bourbon Trail absolutely should not be driving, or Napa Valley, different wine communities, and you have an entertainment experience on board your AV, all that. Great applications for this. And then while you're learning, you develop the technology and develop a market, and then you head down scale as it grows. Even just like what Maine Mobility had been doing with going from parking areas to, central business districts, stuff like that. All really good applications for this. Cruise and Waymo decided that it was going to be, replacing Uber and Lyft in San Francisco. I don't know why they didn't try to replace Uber and Lyft in, say, Phoenix to start. Actually, to its credit, Waymo did, but they've moved into San Francisco as well. It's just what they're trying to do is very difficult, very expensive, and tough regulatory environment, very difficult driving environment. And, I think maybe, what you're saying is right, that they should have started off with a luxury experience in a way that was easier to drive. And that's what we're seeing trucking do, right? They're not trying to drive semis in Manhattan or delivery trucks in Manhattan. They're trying to drive these out on highways and outer suburban rings where Walmart has distribution centers and stuff like that. Easier driving, predictable routes, real need for it. Like, there's got to be a rethink on autonomy here. And I think Waymo doesn't have to do it because they haven't had these problems, but we do see them doing more work out in cities that are easier to drive in.
With the current market conditions, Alphabet's balance sheet being what it is, I know Ruth Port and the board of Alphabet are under investor pressure to cut spending on Waymo, but they clearly are the leader in robo-taxis for autonomous passenger cars. Do we see Waymo take advantage of the market conditions and look to accelerate past Austin to bring more cities online, or to really shock and awe the market and publicly announce a licensing program to further capitalize on the missteps at Cruise?
Well, they are, yeah. I mean, look, they're already starting to move, but what's kept Waymo out of trouble is they've been pretty cautious with pace of deployment, size of fleet, and where they're going. So, look, we've seen them move to Phoenix and Austin, right? Haven't they set up shop in both?
Yep, Austin's coming online, then LA's coming online. I got to give credit to Waymo for when they have not operated full commercial service in Los Angeles, but they called it the Waymo Tour. They went community by community, invited individuals who live in the community to ride in the vehicles and ask questions, to get comfortable with it. And then they opened up an early rider program in the Beverly Hills, West Hollywood region to start building that trust. Waymo, by doing that early rider program, by going and hosting a tour and sending Waymo executives down there to answer questions, that's a really great way to build trust. It's slow and steady, the old tortoise and the hare, analogy, and that just seems where Waymo's going.
No, it is. And they were never pushing quite as hard as Cruise was. Kyle Vogt, this was in one of my stories, the former CEO of Cruise, he was really worried that they would become Lyft to Waymo's Uber. Second in all of these markets, second in market share, wouldn't establish a beachhead of market presence and name recognition and regular users the way Lyft or the way Uber did. That's not illogical. The technology wasn't quite ready for it. I think that's more clear. And then they didn't handle relationships with the governments very well.
You talked about this in several of your stories. You've done a really great job covering Cruise and GM for that matter. How much of this went all the way up to Kyle? Because we saw the email that was leaked from David Estrada on one of their attorneys that was leaked. And I'm not going to make a comment on that, but you can read it. And how much of this went up to Kyle and the culture that was at Cruise?
We don't know specifically with reference to how to David. So David Estrada's email is about that incident where Nissan Sentra, for viewers who haven't read every scrap of copy about this, Nissan Sentra driver hits a woman, throws her in front of a Cruise. Cruise vehicle hits her and stops. She's under the vehicle. The vehicle does what it's supposed to do, which is pull over because it doesn't know or doesn't recognize or doesn't have an algorithm to tell it what to do when there's somebody under the vehicle. She gets dragged, terrible injuries, tragic case. That incident happens on October 2nd. October 3rd, there's an email from Cruise at David Estrada, government affairs head, who's now no longer with the company, talking about the incident, but doesn't mention a word about the woman being dragged. California regulators allege that Cruise never really showed them the video of the woman being dragged, so they're trying to hide it. We don't know, and maybe we will find out once the internal investigation is done, whether Kyle knew about it, told them to do it, anything like that. We'll see. The fact that he's resigned says that he's got some ownership of this. At a minimum, he's the CEO. He's got some ownership. I do think in case of Kyle, this has been in my stories, that there was a culture of wanting to move fast. And, if you look at the public documents, California regulators, including the fire department, accused Cruise of just not being cooperative and being obstructive. So if they're right, if that's the culture, then this go fast push by Kyle maybe created that environment. We'll see more once that investigation is out. But that's certainly what the regulators think. And they don't say that about Waymo. So that's two different approaches to how you handle the government. I mean, look, they were arguing with the fire department. I just never understood why you would do that. Everyone loves firemen. Why pick a fight with these guys? It's just not when you can win. There are people who don't like the police. There is, they defund the police movement, however small it was, but it's out there. And people criticize the police all the time. No one argues with the fire department. and that's where Cruise was. So, and it was tolerated. I don't know if we can hang everything on Kyle, but, that went on for a while. So clearly it was tolerated. We'll find out more later. But yeah, the culture just wasn't one where they were keen on developing great relations with government. In California, that is.
Let's look at the culture. You look at another company that had cultural issues that have been well documented was Uber. This is pre-Dara. Dara came into Uber, completely turned the company around. I mean, obviously, the market's up for tech, big rebound this year, and Uber's been a beneficiary of that. But the individual I speak to that interact and work with Dara on a regular basis, on a daily basis, say he's a very calming influence, very focused on the culture, very focused on the business, and the results have shown in the stock. Who becomes Cruise's version of Dara? An individual from the outside that comes in there, reboots the culture, and sets the company up for success.
So look, right now they've got GM's general counsel, Craig Glidden, as a co-president. Mo Elshenaway, more of a tech guy, veteran of Cruise, is the other president. The general counsel comes in to right the ship, roll some heads, which they've done, and blow up this culture of we're going to move fast, Silicon Valley mindset, and these government regulators can't stand it. All that's gone because they fired all these people. And Glidden's not a guy to suffer through something that's hurting the company's reputation and exposing it to risk like this. From what I hear about, I don't know Mo, I haven't interviewed him. When I hear about him, he is a calming presence and somebody who wants to, work to develop this technology. He's on board with the pace they're going, has respect among people who are in engineering and development there. And I think he is more of a calming force within the company. That's what I'm gathering. And I think, GM would purposely put him in that position to do it. They're not going to want to remake what they had before. It's got to be 180 degrees. Here's a question for you on this. So Cruise had this one incident. No one's died in an AV since the Uber accident 5 or 6 years ago in Phoenix. This incident with the woman is truly terrible. I'm not sure Cruise would have lost their license over that had they not played games with regulators. And given what Cruise has gone through the past couple months, does the punishment fit the crime?
No.
You don't think so?
No, I don't think so. I think it's the cover-up that hurt them.
Right.
And it's certain individuals with loud microphones that are beating the drum. They're instigating and causing this. And it's coming from, I have a friend years ago, he called them keyboard warriors. They'll get behind their keyboard, pretend they're at war with you, and they'll blast this all over the internet, but then they won't get in your face and in person actually want to fight you. So you had that contingent there. If they were honest and transparent, we wouldn't be having this conversation today. Could they have made smaller changes, rebooted a few things? Yes, but it's the Nixon. That's what sunk Nixon, was the cover-up. And I'm not saying it's a cover-up, I'm saying it possibly could be a cover-up, but what we know from the facts that we see today, that there was a lack of transparency. And who to blame, I don't know. But we would not be having this conversation today if there was full transparency.
That's right. And the other part of that is they were having these arguments with San Francisco and arguments with the fire department. There was a movement with the San Francisco MTA, the Transit Authority, and the Teamsters Union to get in their way, the same as those organizations did with Uber and Lyft, because they didn't want competition. And they brought up safety as a debate point with Cruz. So you've got that kind of opposition, both city and union opposition. And you do something like this, in a way, walking into a trap of their own making. You couldn't script what a bad idea that was when you've got opposition in the city and the community that doesn't like you. And by the way, Waymo has some of this opposition within the community too. There was a story I did before we knew the degree of this accident at Cruz, just all the different social pressure and problems that autonomous vehicles are facing in San Francisco. I mean, look, people put cones in front of Waymo vehicles too to screw up their driving and graffiti them and this sort of thing. The first anecdote we had in that story we did was at a concert. Patti Smith is on stage, and the MC came out to introduce her and then named the sponsors, one being Waymo, and there was a chorus of boos. So there's a lot of opposition just within the community from different corners. And then you go and fight the city, which just makes you look bad. So that maybe in literal terms for what actually happened, the punishment might not fit the crime, where they scale back their operations and lay all these people off and everything else. But they walked into it. And it's tough to be too sympathetic. But now, look, they're doing what Mary Barra did with ignition switch and with bolt batteries catching on fire. They recalled every single bolt, replaced the batteries, and eventually they went above and beyond what a typical recall is. So they ended up reimbursing battery partner LG on some of the costs to it, which they didn't have to do legally, but they did it because some of those costs were things they weren't legally required to do. So she wants to go above and beyond to just get these problems behind them as quickly as they can. And there's, financial and social and operational costs to it. And that's where we are.
If I was CEO of Cruise, once the cone incident happened, I would have ceased everything, turned the PR machine on, and said, look at this unsafe environment that these individuals are trying to create and expose where the money came from. But let's go back in the history of Cruise. When Don Almond was CEO, he had it right. Dan wanted to move headquarters from San Francisco to Miami, relocate everything to Miami, and start rebuilding in Miami. That would have been a game changer because you wouldn't have the opposition in Miami that you have in San Francisco. Miami's welcoming to autonomous vehicles. Argo operated there when they did. May Mobility is expanding into Miami next year. At some point, Waymo's going to expand into Miami. You have Wall Street South. Bloomberg's done a really good job of covering that with all the hedge funds that have moved there. You have economic viability. Was Dan right, in your opinion? I think he was, to leave San Francisco and relocate to Miami and bring the operations there and start building an Eastern Seaboard run?
Well, you need to keep development in San Francisco because that's where the software engineers live. And you don't want to try to force them to relocate unless they want to. So you want to keep that center there. That said, relocating headquarters and operations there probably was a much smarter idea. The only caveat I'd say to that is Cruise was having issues in Austin with cars stalling out, gumming up intersections, and angering citizens, other drivers, police. They were having the same problems, some of the same problems in Austin they were having in San Francisco. The real shameful part about this whole incident with Cruise is the accident that led to this is like the edge case of all edge cases. I mean, you have a hit and run driver throws a woman in front of your car, at the exact moment where she's going to get struck and thrown under the vehicle. I mean, this is like something you might imagine in some crazy, like Too Fast, Too Furious action movie. And I mean, just the rarest thing. And so, like, really bad luck there, but their vehicle didn't know how to handle it. And it comes on the heels of hitting a fire truck. It comes on the heels of clogging up intersections in San Francisco and Austin. And what it did is it laid bare the fact that the technology really wasn't as ready as they thought. And I think that would be the case in Miami as well. Now, if Ammon were still there, would they have throttled back once they started having incidents? Very possibly. I remember interviewing Kyle last summer, before they went to Austin and San Francisco, and it was right after they had two incidents. They had the 12 cars at the intersection in San Francisco, and then they had another accident where Prius was going 40 in a 25-mile-an-hour zone, didn't yield while making a left-hand turn, accident with the Cruise vehicle. The Cruise vehicle was not at fault legally, but it still got a lot of scrutiny from government officials. And what it led to people questioning whether or not autonomous vehicles can deal with bad human drivers. And that's an open question for me. And it may not be fair to the AV companies, but right now, where government mindset is on this, and where the public is on this, there's sort of this assumption that if Grayson or David Welch is driving, we see this guy driving like a maniac and we let him go and the accident doesn't happen. I don't know if that's true, but that's sort of what everyone thinks. And so they're kind of blaming a lot of the accidents on the self-driving car companies and their technology. And it's sort of like right now where the regulatory landscape seems to be is they're willing to throw out the good while waiting for the perfect. And I think that's a tough place for them to be. And because of that, I do think that even if Cruise moved to Miami, you'd be finding some of these same incidents. I also don't think they would have abandoned San Francisco. So you're going to continue to have these problems. But maybe Ammon would have expanded bigger in Miami faster instead of San Francisco. And it's easier to drive there. So, maybe you avoid some of this. But, I still think that the way Cruise was going, they were pushing to monetize this thing faster, sooner rather than later. And they could have ended up having a lot of these issues. Now, Dan may have had different government affairs people and may have listened to them. That might have been a big difference as well, because these were not the people who got fired over this and whose names are on the emails with California DMV were not hired by Dan.
You look at government, some of that you and I both know, he's a friend, a personal friend of mine, is Rob Grant. He's no longer with Cruise. He left way before this. He was an honest, transparent gentleman that did a lot of really good stuff when he was running government affairs. He didn't have these issues. Does this come down to a hiring issue? And Rob was close with Dan. Does this really just come down to a hiring issue of not hiring the right individuals?
Look, I mean, clearly they did because all these people are out. But Rob Grant left Cruise it was earlier this year when a lot of people, high-level executives, left the company. I mean, these are big positions. So Grant left, head of government affairs. Bill Nash, the CFO, quit. Chief product officer, Oliver Cameron, who came from Voyage, he quit. Head of public relations, Kristen Boyden, left. And then there was another guy who was in my story, I think might have been their head of AI, or one of their top scientists also quit. So you're talking people in very big positions who left the company after their shares vested and they could cash out. And then months later, they have all these problems. To me, that says a lot. And, Rob being one of them, and then he left early in the year. And after that, you start to see problems with the city. It's in all the emails and public documents. Government affairs soured after that. So they brought in people who took a different approach. And, other top executives leave. I mean, look, as a financial journalist, when the finance guy quits, it's just this red flag snapping in the wind. You can't ignore it. And then you look, the head of PR, they had issues with PR. She had left, and all these areas where they have problems is when the old regime left the company.
Yeah, and that raises the question, and I'm not an attorney and I'm not a journalist, but what did they know and when did they know? That obviously, they're very clearly that the vesting was there and they were able to cash out, but what did they know that led them to make that decision and not stick it out? That's the big question.
Yeah, they aren't obviously publicly talking. Maybe they'll be interviewed in this investigation. We don't know. But I think some of the things that that I've written about with the culture of the company just getting too aggressive, I think that was a piece of it. Everybody wants to be part of a hot startup that's got great potential. And at the point where it starts to look like it's running too risky and it's going to cause itself problems and the potential isn't going to be realized, people are going to head for the door.
You look at another company that had turnover in the CEO role and autonomy was Zoox when they ousted Tim Kentley-Clay prior to the acquisition by Amazon. Zoox has been quiet, not making a lot of noise. Where are they going? Do they try and capitalize on what's happening with Cruise? Because for a long time, you and I both talked about this, Zoox was nowhere to be found. It's a two-horse race between Waymo and Cruise. Now, for all practical purposes, Cruise is out of the race. Does Zoox try and step in to fill that void on a more measured approach?
God, we haven't heard anything from them. If they're going to do it, they're being really quiet about it. I know they have that Amazon has made other bets on autonomy. I've kind of thought for the longest time that they would switch to doing what Amazon does, which is deliver packages and run machines through warehouses rather than robo-taxi. We just haven't heard anything about whether or not they really want to push hard into robo-taxi the way Cruise and Waymo were. And I think the whole industry is rethinking it, not just the technology side of it, but although I think that is being rethought, will the technology ever be good enough? I mean, never's a very long time. Will the technology be good enough in a time that somebody can develop, without breaking the bank? I think that's an issue. And there are much easier uses for autonomy, particularly commercial applications, that make a lot more sense right now. And I wouldn't be surprised if they were doing that, but I don't have any inside dope on where Zoox is with this, unfortunately.
If you look at Amazon, they have the warehouse with the key for robotics. They announced Vivian Summers-Hart as their head of autonomous trucking, so they clearly have ambitions in trucking. It makes sense for Amazon to get into autonomous trucking, middle-mile logistics for autonomy, yard autonomy. I can't figure out for the life of me of why Amazon bought Zoox and what they're planning on doing for it. I've heard for a long time that Zoox is going to have nothing to do with trucking. It's be purely focused on robotaxi. It doesn't fit into Amazon unless it becomes Amazon does something with a prime mobility tier, but I just can't figure it out why Amazon made that acquisition. And then prior to that acquisition, Walmart was at the table looking at potentially acquiring Zoox as well, which I still can't figure out why.
I'm with you. I can't figure out because we don't know what they're going to do with it or what they are doing with it, why they've gone to these lengths. Isn't Walmart, their bet seems to be just kind of working with Gatik, right? That's their big play to do, the middle mile stuff that has them, going between stores and distribution centers, which makes a ton of sense for them. And to me, I mean, you've been a big fan of trucking. All of those models are, answer a question that does need to be answered. They're developing, I would say, kind of slowly in the sense that they don't have a lot of commercial action out there. It's sort of, test beds here and there, but they're doing it at a smart pace, and there's a real business there. We know there's a real business there. I think Gatik is already monetizing it, as a matter of fact, but small and early stage still.
Yeah, Walmart has a large autonomous trucking program. They don't publicly talk about it, but Walmart's kicking the tires, I want to use that term, working with everybody. If you look at, let's go across the board. UPS has an autonomous trucking program. FedEx has an autonomous trucking program. Amazon's now announced that they have an autonomous trucking program. Moving goods, there's a use case there. When you remove the driver and you start optimizing the economics, there's a clear path to profitability, especially when you choose long OTR over the road lanes. You can start removing some of those costs. That becomes really, really interesting. But yet, Amazon just has this, I don't know, I want to call it a shiny ball just sitting there floating, and the cash burn is getting astronomical. But if you look at Amazon under Jassy, this is all public data, they have 8 to 12% availability in their warehouses now. They started optimizing the warehouses. They decreased spending on warehouse, and now looking at fully optimizing the assets that they have. So if you look at everything that Jassy's done since he's come into CEO, is optimize the business, start to cut costs, streamline it. But yet Zoox just sits out here, they're hiring, and they're spending money with no path to clearly, one, repaying the acquisition cost, and two, starting to generate meaningful revenue. And again, this goes back to I don't understand because it goes against the opposite of what Jassy's publicly doing with Amazon.
You're trying to figure out what his play is in autonomy then?
I'm trying to figure out what his play is in autonomy, how it's going to fit into the jigsaw with every other move that he's making around cost optimization. Yet Zoox keeps spending money with no clear indication to the market. I want to say the market to Wall Street of what they plan on doing with it. You run a search on the terminal for Zoox in the Amazon documents from analysts. Hardly anything ever comes up. There's very any mentions in the Amazon reports.
That's a great point. Like you sit on the earnings calls and like, where is the question about what they're going to do with this and when they're going to see some payback on the spending? I'd love to know myself, but I got to think that first, they have plenty of money, obviously, to fund this thing. They're not in a big hurry on it, but it has gone very secretive. I got to think that they're looking for, like, why would Amazon want to be in the robo-taxi business? It just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Doesn't mean they won't do it, but it doesn't make a lot of sense to me when what they should really be focused on would be, if cost optimization is the mantra, particularly in their DCs and their hub and spoke system. Why wouldn't you do that? Find ways to automate the work there, which they already do. Like they already have a lot of automation in their picking and just their warehousing centers, and that's easy for autonomous vehicles to tool up and down the aisles of these things. And then you have autonomous vehicles out there to deliver packages, where you have an employee on board whose job is to walk packages up to the house, and he's kind of sorting through stuff in the back the whole time. He's really managing the freight as opposed to driving the vehicle. It just seems to me like that's where they should be spending their time and energy. But you and I keep questioning where the money is in robotaxi. So maybe they see money there. I'm not saying there isn't either. It's a question I keep asking every executive. Okay, what are the margins like on this business? I was at ARTS 23 this year, the Autonomous Vehicle Conference it was in Irvine this year, I think. And there was an investor panel right before the journalist panel that I was on. And, they're saying autonomy is just uninvestable right now because they can't get a handle on when and how it brings a profit. So that being the case, if they can't figure it out, it's going to be tough for us to figure out. And the companies aren't really explaining it very well because I'm not sure they have the answers. There are a lot of things about a robotaxi business model in addition to managing the fleet. What kind of vehicle do you really need? I'm not sure Cruise's 4 to 6 passenger vehicle was the origin. I'm not sure that was the right idea because at the time they launched that, Dan Ammon was CEO and he said it had to be shared. But to the extent that anyone actually wanted a shared ride, that died during COVID. And Uber and Lyft, their shared rides are a very small percentage. So I don't know that we need that kind of vehicle. Maybe for certain experiences you'd have some, but probably, something that looks like the Chevy Bolts that they use right now is just fine. Or in Waymo's case, they're using luxury vehicles, so you get a better experience out of the ride. Maybe it should be a bunch of Cadillac Lyrics or something like that drive people around. So I think jury's out on who's going to use robotaxi, how they're going to use it, what kind of experience they want, how much companies are going to be able to charge. It's that the whole business model is still, I think, up in the air. So I'm not sure why someone like Amazon, unless they found better answers to those questions, would want to spend their money there when they've got such a massive distribution operation that would probably lower costs with automation.
Yeah, share rides went the way of the dinosaur. The consumers never wanted them, but yet there was this mentality of autonomy for all. And I'm down there harping for years that it's a luxury product. And that's what it's going to be. It's going to be a luxury product for at least the next 5 to 10 years. It'll go down market. If I'm Mary Barr and I'm an executive at GM, I am looking at, can I create a hands-off, eyes-off version of a Cadillac product that can go from a suburban house on a highway, and then when you get to a dense urban environment, you have to put your hands back on. That's an interesting product that consumers would pay for, and that is a luxury product.
It is. This idea that you're going to compete with public transit, people want something different than that out of a robotaxi. Competing with Uber and Lyft works, and you can certainly improve the Uber and Lyft experience, but it doesn't seem that technology is really there yet. So I look at this and think, I'd love to see someone come out with a rethink on what this business can do. and start with something that's higher end, because and to that degree, Waymo's kind of got the better idea. They're using luxury vehicles, right? So you get a better experience out of it. The Bolt's perfectly fine. It will absolutely get you around, and I've been in them. They do just fine. I had no issues when I've been in Cruise's vehicles. But if you're going to provide a different experience, maybe you do want a better car for that. Something more roomy, something more luxurious. It's got possibilities.
You do. I've ridden both in the Waymo vehicle and the Jaguar I-Pace and the Cruise and Chevy Bolt. It's night and day experience. It's a completely night and day experience, and I'm willing to pay more for the Waymo vehicle for that experience. Waymo's done a really good job with the UI as well. I also think the Waymo vehicle is smoother than the Cruise vehicle, but it's a luxury product. Now imagine you start putting an entertainment layer on top of that, or you put a shopping layer, as we said. Rethinking robo-taxis to make it a luxury product is great. Amazon has the ability to do it, to integrate it into a prime mobility tier. Perhaps there's certain prime mobility tiers in, say, San Francisco, Miami, where they're looking at opening a new headquarters. That makes sense, because then all of a sudden they get people to pay, say, $300 a month, unlimited rides in those cities. You start doing the math on that, you're going to get their super riders, then you're going to the riders will only use it once a month, twice a month, but they want the ability not to think. That becomes interesting, but the payback period's long, but it becomes interesting, and Amazon in that standpoint it could have a path forward. The one who I'm struggling to also figure out is Motional. Where are they going? They're very big in Vegas, and then they're looking at expanding to Santa Monica, Los Angeles, but they're kind of just slow and steady, it seems.
Well, yeah, a lot of these smaller AV companies are, particularly the privately held ones, because they don't have as much money. So even if they wanted to, they can't deploy as fast as Cruise and Waymo were. They get funding from massive public companies that have a lot of cash. So it's harder for them to do it. And I think, look, if I'm a smaller company with less cash and smaller overall administrative infrastructure, something like just happened, like what we've seen at Cruise, could kill one of those companies. They just wouldn't have the ability to handle that. Or they could get through it, but do they have the ability to do what GM is doing, to bring the company back, reboot, and clean up their reputation and all that? Really tough to do without somebody with a big checkbook. So they have to be a lot slower. That's just all there is to it. I think it's going to be really hard for those guys, because there's just so much talk now that, and I'm talking on the technology side, that autonomy is going to take a lot longer than everyone expected. It already has, but this could be a next decade thing where you really see these cars in big numbers.
David, it's been a really insightful conversation. We really shedded a lot of stuff on the robo-taxi market. How do you see the robo-taxi market evolving over the next 5 years? Is it going to be the same as we've currently experienced? A lot of ups and downs, maybe some success, maybe some triumphs. Where do you see it going?
It's hard to see anything but that going forward, because I do think you'll see some of these incidents going forward. The technology will get better, so some of these things were not necessarily safety problems. We haven't had a lot of safety problems with robo-taxis, but you will see some issues that inconvenience people or annoy regulators, annoy the cops, annoy other drivers. And that always gives you some of these bumps in the road for the development of the market. Technology is going to get better, and you'll see fewer of those. But I kind of come back to the thing that's really going to have to change and evolve is what the business model is. Is this a luxury? Is this like a black car service at the end of the day? Could be. And that's sort of what Waymo has going right now. At one point, Cruise was talking about this being a premium service, and I think that's where we're going to go. I think that's where it has to go to start, because you can charge a bit more for it because it's an experience and a nicer ride. So you're not in this huge rush to build out tons of robo-taxis all over the place. Because the other thing we haven't talked about is all of these companies that have AVs, they've got someone who kind of monitors that fleet one way or another. It's not all the same, and it's not necessarily it's not like there's a human monitoring every vehicle out there, but they have people who watch what the fleet's doing in case there are issues. And if you have a massive fleet, you need more of them, and it gets complicated. And if there's an incident, the response times vary. It's not great. So if you have fewer of them, you're charging more, you're perfecting the technology, and you're giving premium and luxury buyers a better experience. I think that's where it's going to have to go.
I agree with that. Do you see these companies potentially hiring more seasoned business executives with business model experience, finance experience over engineers that really try and monetize the creation of the engineers that built?
Yeah, look, that's a natural progression of startups, right? You have this founder type who, push hard to get the technology going, and he's the scientist. And then at a certain point, maybe that's where these guys are right now, Cruise and Waymo, and even some of the startups that do trucking stuff. They're all either at or getting closer to that point where you need a business operator and a manager to come in and run the company, as opposed to the tech side. You still need that talent on board, and maybe even that individual. If Dan Ammon had not been fired, I think, this was in one of my stories, Kyle Vogt might still be there because he didn't want to be CEO. He kind of reluctantly took it. He was chief technology officer, and having him as CTO with somebody who's overseeing the operations or who has more experience running a company, that's the kind of model I think you see going forward.
It's a model if you look at the history of Wall Street, it's a model that's proven success. When you have a really great executive team, you have success. And the company I talk a lot about is ABC Capital Cities. Look at the returns that they did to beating the S&P for all those years. They had a really great frugal management team. On the frugalness, when does cost discipline finally come into this industry? Every other industry that Bloomberg covers every day, cost cutting, cost discipline, you hear it every day on Bloomberg. But you don't hear it in the robo-taxi. Obviously, we had the layoffs at Cruise, but it doesn't seem like there's a cultural fit. When does cost discipline come into this industry?
Well, in some ways it is. If you look at some of these startups like Gatik is one I'm thinking of, even May Mobility, they're talking about funding rounds in the tens of millions. So they have to be cost disciplined or they don't exist. That's one thing. Cruise is spending recent quarters, $700 million, and GM's drawing that back by laying people off. That's a lot of money. And these other companies don't. So some of them do have it if they haven't gone public yet. And I think the others are going to have to do it. We really still haven't seen Aurora do some sort of big restructuring or anything like that. They raised money. But if they're not doing it already, any AV company is going to need to get disciplined because the horizon of monetizing this just seems to be, I don't know whether it's 3 steps forward and 2 back or 2 forward and 3 back, but the horizon's pretty far out there. And the longer it takes, the more skeptical investors are.
It's a long horizon, but when we get there, it's going to be very profitable. In my opinion, the companies that stick it through will be rewarded handsomely along with their investors and shareholders that stood with them. It's just a lot's going to me, 2025 is a big year. We're going to see the trucking guys go drive route. We're going to see hopefully some more financial insight. And that to me becomes the big year in autonomy from a business standpoint. David, this has been a really insightful conversation. So thank you as always for coming on. As we look to wrap up, what would you like our listeners to take away with them today?
I'm kind of a broken record on this one, but if you're really waiting on autonomous vehicles to take over the roads, or you're waiting for your investment in one to cash out, it's going to be a while. It'll happen, but it's going to take a long time. I just think that's where we are. And everything that we're seeing happen right now tells us that there's really no catalyst that's speeding that up right now.
What I say is stay the course if you're an investor. If you're interested in the space, find the right opportunity and hold on because it will reward you in the future. The future is bright. The future is autonomous. The future is a luxury robo-taxi experience. David, thank you so much for coming on the Road to Autonomy today.
Thanks for having me.
If you've enjoyed listening, please kindly rate, review, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Want to get in touch? Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube at Road to Autonomy, or email podcast@roadtoautonomy.com. The Road to Autonomy podcast is produced by the Road to Autonomy LLC. The views and opinions expressed on the Road to Autonomy podcast do not necessarily reflect those views of the Road to Autonomy, its subsidiaries, its shareholders, directors, investors, or partners. The content discussed on this podcast is for informational purposes only. It should not be taken as legal, investment, tax, or business advice. Nothing is a recommendation that you purchase, sell, or hold any security or other investment, or that you pursue any investment style or strategy. The content of this podcast is presented on an as-is basis with no warranties, express or implied, of any kind. Financial mentions about companies in the Road to Autonomy Index and discussions about the Road to Autonomy Indexes are for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon when making any investment decision. Furthermore, an inclusion of security within the Road to Autonomy Index is not a recommendation by the Road to Autonomy Indices, LLC, to buy, sell, or hold that such security, nor is it considered to be investment advice.